Hey guys, tonight we're journeying back to a time when surviving wasn't a victory lap, but the start of a whole new nightmare. We're exploring why it sucked to be a medieval plague survivor. Imagine, if you will, the sun struggling to peek over the thatched roofs of your village. But instead of the usual chorus of crowing roosters, barking dogs, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, there's nothing, just a heavy, suffocating silence. The air itself feels different, thin and sharp, carrying a scent you can't quite place but instinctively recoil from. You're one of the few left. And honestly, looking around at the empty homes and silent streets, you probably won't survive what comes next either, at least not with your sanity intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stir, not from a noise, but from the oppressive lack of it. It's the kind of quiet that usually only happens deep in the woods, far from any human settlement, or perhaps in the dead of a snow-choked winter. But this is your village, or what's left of it, and the season is wrong for such stillness. Your eyelids flutter open, gritty and heavy. The small shuttered window of your hut allows only a sliver of weak morning light to penetrate the gloom. It paints a dusty stripe across the rough-hewn table where a half-eaten crust of bread sits. A relic from a time that already feels like another life. A life from how long ago was it? Days? A week? Time has become a blur, a murky soup of fever, fear, and the fading cries of your neighbors. A dry cough escapes your lips and you freeze listening. The sound is unnaturally loud in the silence. An unwelcome intrusion, you hold your breath, waiting for a response. Any response, a shout, a moan, the familiar shuffle of someone else waking. Nothing, just the thumping of your own heart, a frantic drum against your ribs. This quiet, you realize, is the sound of absence. It's the auditory equivalent of a freshly dug grave. It's almost too quiet, like that unsettling moment when a toddler who's been making a racket suddenly goes silent, and you just know they're up to something. Except here, the something has already happened. Slowly, tentatively, you push aside the thin, lice-ridden blanket. Your limbs are stiff, your muscles ache with a deep, weary soreness, but the burning fever that had gripped you for days seems to have subsided. You're weak, hollowed out, but alive. A chilling thought, that alive when so many are not. You remember the sickness, the sudden chills, the fire in your veins, the painful, swollen lumps, the buboes in your groin and armpits. You remember the priest, his face a mask of terror even as he mumbled prayers, his own hands shaking as he offered last rites from a safe distance. He's gone now. Everyone, it seems, is gone. You swing your legs over the side of the low pallet, your bare feet touching the cold, packed earth floor. The chill is a shock, but it helps clear some of the fog in your head. You need water. Your throat feels like sandpaper, the small clay pitcher by the door. Empty. Of course, no one has been here to fill it. You'll have to go to the well. The thought of stepping outside, of confronting the reality of this new, silent world, sends a shiver of pure dread down your spine. It's one thing to suspect, to know in the hazy recesses of your recovering mind. It's another to see it. Taking a deep breath, or trying to, the air still feels strangely thin. You unlatch the wooden door. It groans in protest, another sound amplified by the vacuum of normal village life. You step out into the pale morning. The village green, usually a bustling hub of activity by this hour, is deserted. Chickens, a few scrawny ones, peck desultorily at the dirt, their clucking strangely subdued. A dog ribs showing whines from a doorway across the way but doesn't approach. Doors to cottages stand ajar, some swinging gently in the faint breeze, dark moors revealing nothing but shadow within, no smoke curls from chimneys, no children's laughter echoes, no women gossip by the well. It's a ghost town populated only by you and the ghosts of memory. The sheer scale of the depopulation that occurred during visitations of the Black Death is staggering. Historians confirm that in many regions of Europe, between 30% and 60% of the entire population perished in just a few short years, beginning in the mid-14th century. Some villages were wiped out entirely, literally ceasing to exist. You walk towards the well, your footsteps crunching softly on the dusty path. Each step feels heavy, as if you're wading through something thick and unseen. The silence presses in, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow. A sound that now seems ominous, like a carrion bird waiting. You remember the frantic, desperate measures people took. Burning incense, carrying posies of herbs to ward off the bad air, or the miasma, which many believed carried the pestilence. Some even wore amulets filled with arsenic, or if you can believe it, dried toad. It's a quirky, grim little tidbit of history that people genuinely believed that the foul smells themselves were the primary cause of the disease, rather than the fleas on rats we now know were the culprits. The irony is some of those strong-smelling herbs might have incidentally repelled a few fleas, but it was a drop in an ocean of contagion. As you approach the well, you see it, a body lying near the stone surround. It's old man Hemlock, the village carpenter, or it was. His face is turned away. But the unnatural stillness, the swarm of flies, there's no doubt. You avert your gaze, your stomach churning. The sickness didn't just kill, it left its gruesome signature on its victims. Historians still argue whether the immediate psychological reaction of survivors like you was one of profound, paralyzing despair, or a kind of numbed, almost robotic functionality, a primal instinct to simply keep going because the alternative was unthinkable. Right now you feel a bit of both, a vast, empty horror and a strange, detached need to get water. You reach the well, your eyes carefully avoiding Hemlock's form. The bucket is there, the rope frayed but serviceable. You lower it, the creak of the winch, another profane noise in this sepulchral quiet. The splash as it hits the water far below is startling. You haul it up hand over hand, the effort making you dizzy. The water is cool, clear. You drink deeply, ignoring the metallic tang, focusing only on the relief it brings to your parched throat. Looking around, you can't help but think, well, at least finding a new house won't be a problem. There's a grim abundance of vacancies now. You could probably take your pick of the choicest hovels. A dark joke, and it tastes like ash in your mouth. The silence that follows feels even heavier, a judgment on your inappropriate levity. This isn't just a quiet morning. This is the end of the world as you knew it. The water, though life-giving, does little to wash away the horror that is dawning in full. With your immediate thirst quenched, your gaze lifts from the chipped rim of the bucket and sweeps across the silent desolation. Old man Hemlock by the well is just the beginning. As your eyes adjust, or perhaps as the initial shock wears off enough for your brain to process what it's seeing, more shapes become apparent. A crumpled form in the doorway of the baker's cottage. A hand pale and still visible through the grimy window of what was once the weaver's home. You realize that the strange, subtle sweetness you noticed in the air, previously masked by dust and the lingering scent of wood smoke from long-dead fires, is the cloying, unmistakable odor of decay. It's faint for now, the cool morning air keeping its worst advances at bay, but you know with a certainty that chills you to the bone that it will grow. It will become a suffocating blanket over this village, a constant, inescapable reminder. You take a few more steps, an unwilling explorer in your own home. The village green, normally a place of play and commerce, now looks like a macabre art installation. It seems the plague struck people down wherever they were, mid-stride, mid-task. Here, a woman lies, her market basket overturned beside her, a few shriveled apples rolling into the dust. There, two children curled together as if sleeping near the big oak tree where they always played. The dog you saw earlier is now sniffing at one of them, a low, mournful whine escaping its throat before it slinks away, cowed by the enormity of the silence and the wrongness of it all. You shoo it, half-heartedly. "Get on, mutt," you mutter, the words feeling like pebbles in your dry mouth. "Nothing for you here," you almost add, "or for any of us, but bite it back." The sheer number is overwhelming. It's not just one or two unexpected deaths. It's everyone, or so it seems. With each house you pass, each familiar landmark, the weight of it presses down harder. These aren't just bodies. They were your neighbors, your friends, the people who made up the fabric of your small world. That's Agnes, who always had a sharp word but a hidden kindness. That's Thomas, who told the worst jokes but could fix anything. Their stories, their laughter, their arguments, all silenced. It's like someone snuffed out all the candles in a vast church, plunging it into an eternal, terrifying darkness. A grim thought takes root. If you don't do something, who will? The bodies can't stay here, not like this. Apart from the unbearable sight and the encroaching stench, there's the fear of, well, don't know exactly what. More disease, wild animals, the simple, profound disrespect of it all. Your mind, still sluggish from your own recent brush with death, struggles to prioritize. But the primal urge to cover, to hide, to somehow make it right is strong. It's a monumental, horrific task, this burying of the world, or at least your small corner of it. You're one person, weak and alone. How can you possibly manage? You approach the nearest body, Old Man Hemlock. You knew him not well, but he'd mended your stool once and his gruffness was legendary. Now he's just remains. You try to take his arm. The skin is cold, waxy. An involuntary shudder runs through you. This is harder than you imagined. Not just physically, though, he's a dead weight. But emotionally, it feels like a violation, disturbing the already disturbed. You try to pull. He doesn't budge much. You need a cart, a wheelbarrow, something. But even if you find one, loading him and then the next one and the next, it's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon, a really, really gross teaspoon. Your gaze drifts to the churchyard. It's small, lumpy ground already crowded with the graves of generations past. There won't be room, not for this many, not for a catastrophe of this scale. The sheer logistics are a nightmare. The official response during the height of the Black Death often involved the digging of massive plague pits because individual burials became impossible. In cities like London or Florence, these pits could contain hundreds, even thousands of bodies, layered like a grotesque lasagna. You recall hushed whispers from a travelling merchant long before the sickness reached your own village. Tales of such pits in the cities to the south of bodies carted off by the dozen unceremonized, unremembered. At the time it had seemed like a horror story from a distant land. Now it's your reality. You begin to walk towards the edge of the village to the field that young Thomas was supposed to plough this spring. It's far enough away, perhaps there. The ground will be softer there than the rocky soil near the church. As you walk, you can't help but notice the personal items scattered around. Poignant remnants of lives abruptly ended. A child's wooden toy, a woman's dropped spindle, a man's cap lying in the mud. Each one a tiny stab to the heart. You think of the medieval belief in the good death, ars moriendi, where one died in bed, confessed, and surrounded by family. This was the opposite. This was the bad death. Sudden, anonymous, and terrifyingly public. One quirky tidbit from the era describes how in some areas when official burial processes completely broke down, families would sometimes resort to burying their own dead in their gardens or orchards if they had them, rather than leave them for the overburdened and often non-existent collection carts. It was technically against church law, but in such desperate times, necessity often overrode doctrine. You wonder if any of your neighbors in their last lucid moments attempted such a thing, or if anyone else who might have survived the initial wave is even now doing just that, hidden away, engaged in their own private, sorrowful work. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these rapid, often crude mass burials was sanitation, a genuine, if perhaps misguided, fear of further contagion from the corpses, or if it was more about public order and morale, an attempt by the few remaining authorities to remove the horrifying visual evidence of societal collapse. For you, standing on the edge of that fallow field, shovel in hand, you found one leaning against the smithy, its owner presumably beyond needing it. It's a bit of both, plus a heavy dose of sheer, unadulterated horror. You just want them gone, covered, out of sight, so you can pretend for a fleeting moment that the world hasn't completely shattered. The first spadeful of earth is heavy. The second is heavier. Your back screams in protest. Your hands, soft from days of fevered inactivity, quickly blister. This isn't a job for one, it's a job for a dozen strong men. And you feel about as strong as a wet kitten. But you dig. What else is there to do? You dig and you try not to think about who will fill this pit or how. You dig, and the silence of the empty village presses in, a constant accusing witness to your lonely, impossible labor. Each thud of the spade into the soil is a punctuation mark in a sentence of utter despair. The sun climbs higher, the day grows warmer, and the faint, sweet smell in the air begins to strengthen. This is just the beginning. The sun, which had seemed so reluctant to appear this morning, now beats down with a relentless, almost mocking intensity. Sweat stings your eyes and trickles down your back, soaking through your thin tunic. The blisters on your hands have broken, raw and painful. Each grip on the shovel handle an exercise in grim determination. You've managed to clear a shallow depression, barely large enough for one, let alone the village. It's a pathetic start to an impossible task. With each movement, a new ache makes itself known in your shoulders, your legs, your very soul. The silence you woke to has subtly changed. It's no longer just an absence of human noise. Now it's punctuated by the buzzing of flies, a low, constant thrum that seems to be growing louder, more insistent. They are everywhere, bold and unnervingly curious. Every so often you pause, leaning on the shovel, your breath coming in ragged gasps. And in those moments of stillness, the fear, which has been a dull ache beneath the surface of your frantic activity, spikes into sharp, cold panic. What if it's not over? What if the sickness is still here, lurking in the air, on the clothes of the dead, on your own skin? You remember the tales, how it could strike again and again, how some villages thought they were safe, only to be decimated by a second or third wave. You eye your own body with suspicion. Is that a new ache in your groin? A sudden chill despite the heat? Your imagination, fueled by exhaustion and terror, runs wild. Every tickle in your throat, every shadow that flickers at the edge of your vision becomes a potential symptom, a harbinger of doom. This fear is a constant companion now, a shadow that will follow you relentlessly. You feel like you're walking through a minefield, blindfolded, where any misstep could mean a swift, agonizing end. It's like that feeling when you're home alone and hear a creak upstairs. Except the monster isn't just in the house, it's potentially in your own bloodstream. You try to drag Old Man Hemlock towards your pitiful trench. It's a grotesque parody of assistance. His limbs are stiffening, his body uncooperative. You manage to move him only a few feet, the effort leaving you winded and nauseous. The smell up close is far worse. The sickly, sweet, pervasive odor that clings to the back of your throat. You gag, turn away, and spit. This is beyond you. The sheer overwhelming physicality of it, combined with the psychological horror, is crushing. The mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis had several forms, including bubonic, causing the infamous buboes, pneumonic affecting the lungs and spread by coughing, and septicemic infecting the blood. All were terrifyingly swift and lethal. You don't know which form swept through your village or if it was a combination. All you know is its devastating effectiveness. The fear isn't just for yourself. What if there are other survivors hiding, too sick to move? The thought that you might be digging this shallow grave while someone else lies dying alone just a few cottages away is another layer of torment. But the thought of actively searching, of opening those silent doors and confronting whatever horrors lie within, is almost too much to bear. What if you find someone alive but in the throes of the plague? What could you do? You have no remedies, no comfort to offer beyond a drink of water and a shared descent into misery. The helplessness is a suffocating blanket. You recall a quirky and frankly horrifying fringe tidbit you once heard from a travelling peddler, a man who claimed to have seen it with his own eyes in a distant city. He spoke of searchers of the dead, individuals often poor and desperate themselves, who were tasked with going house to house to identify and remove plague victims. Sometimes they were accused of robbing the dead, or worse, of dispatching those who are near death to hasten their own grim work and perhaps limit the spread. You shudder. Are you to become your village's unwilling searcher, its grave digger, its final, lonely witness? Historians still argue whether the recurrence of plague outbreaks over subsequent decades, like the Pestis secunda or Pestis tertia, was due to the same Yersinia pestis strain becoming endemic in the local rodent population, or if new strains were repeatedly reintroduced from elsewhere for you. The academic debate is meaningless. The only thing that matters is the visceral, gut-wrenching terror that it could come back, that this reprieve is temporary, that the silent killer could awaken at any moment. This fear poisons everything. It taints the water you drink, the air you breathe, the very sunlight that warms your skin. It makes you flinch at the sight of a rat scurrying in the shadows, makes you scrutinize every insect bite, makes you eye any other potential survivor with a mixture of hope and profound suspicion. You look back at the village. It seems to shimmer in the heat haze, an illusion of peace overlaying a reality of utter devastation. Even the chickens seem to have vanished now, perhaps sensing the growing menace of the stench or the absence of any scattered scraps. You're truly alone with the dead and the flies. A morbid joke flits through your mind. Well, at least the property values have plummeted. Good time to buy if you're into fixer-uppers with permanent residence. You almost laugh. A harsh, dry sound, but it catches in your throat, morphing into a sob. The futility of your efforts with the shovel becomes starkly apparent. You could dig for a week and not make a dent in the task, and with every passing hour the situation will worsen. The bodies will bloat, the smell will become unbearable, and the risk, real or imagined, will grow. The fear of the plague's return is a living thing coiling in your stomach, whispering insidious possibilities. It tells you to run, to flee this charnel house, to get as far away as possible. But where would you go? What if other villages are the same? What if the roads are filled with desperate, dangerous people? Or worse, what if you carry the sickness with you, a silent harbinger to some other unsuspecting community? The fear traps you, pins you between the horrors you know and the terrors you can only imagine. It's a cruel, invisible cage. This is not just the aftermath of a disaster. It's an ongoing personal torment, a constant vigilant waiting for the other shoe to drop, or for the telltale swelling to appear under your own arm. The sun climbs higher, now directly overhead, baking the deserted village like an oven. You've abandoned the pretense of digging, the shovel lying where you dropped it, a monument to your failed efforts. The silence, once just an absence, now hums with a new energy, the thrum of insects, and the louder, more insistent voice of your owning fear. But beneath that fear, something else is stirring, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of your stomach. Guilt. Survivor's guilt, though you don't have a name for it. Why you? Why, out of all the people in this village, all the souls you knew, are you the ones still breathing, still walking, still capable of feeling the sun's heat and the gnawing ache of hunger? You look at your hands, still raw and blistered from your brief, futile attempt at burial. They are the hands of a survivor, yes, but they feel tainted, unworthy. You remember little Arla, the cooper's daughter, with her bright laugh and tangled sun-bleached hair. She had a passion for chasing butterflies, her small legs pumping furiously as she giggled with delight. She succumbed quickly, her small body overwhelmed by the fever. Why her so full of life and promise and not you? You who grumbled about the rain, who sometimes shirked your chores, who held petty grudges. There's no logic to it, no fairness. The plague was a whimsical tyrant, choosing its victims with a terrifying randomness that defied all understanding of how the world was supposed to work. It's like being the only one to walk away from a catastrophic shipwreck. You're grateful perhaps, but also deeply, uncomfortably aware of all those who didn't make it, their faces haunting your waking thoughts. This guilt is a heavy cloak, suffocating you in the already oppressive heat. It whispers insidious questions in the quiet moments. Did you do something different? Did you unknowingly possess some hidden resilience, some secret ward against the pestilence that others lacked? Or was it simply blind, cruel luck? You recall the village priest, Father Michael, a good man, devout and kind, who spent his last days tending to the sick, offering comfort and prayer, until he too was struck down. Surely if divine favor played a part, he would have been spared. His death, more than any other, perhaps shook the foundations of your understanding. If piety and goodness were no protection, then what was? The weight of their faces, their voices, their small everyday kindnesses and irritations presses down on you. You see Old Man Hemlock, not as the grotesque burden you tried to move, but as the man who patiently showed you how to hold a hammer correctly when you were a child, trying to help him in his workshop. You remember Agnes scolding you for tracking mud into her spotless cottage, then moments later pressing a warm, freshly baked oat cake into your hand with a gruff, "Don't tell anyone I'm soft." These memories, once comforting, now feel like accusations. You lived, they died. It's an equation that makes no sense. A debt you can never repay. The mainstream historical fact here is that the psychological trauma experienced by plague survivors was profound and long-lasting. Beyond the immediate grief and fear, many grappled with what we would now recognize as PTSD depression, and this pervasive survivor's guilt. Medieval society didn't have the language or framework for these conditions, but the records, wills, chronicles, even art hinted a deep societal melancholy and a search for meaning in the face of such overwhelming loss. You feel it acutely, this sense of being untethered, of having passed through a terrible fire that consumed everyone you knew, leaving you scorched and bewildered on the other side. There's a quirky and rather bleak tidbit from some medieval chronicles that mentions how some survivors became almost reckless, indulging in behaviors they never would have considered before: excessive drinking, gambling, or promiscuity. It's as if having stared death in the face and inexplicably been spared, they felt that normal rules no longer applied, or perhaps they were simply trying to feel something, anything, to drown out the ghosts in the guilt. You can almost understand it. The temptation to simply stop caring, to descend into a kind of nihilistic haze, is strong. What's the point of sobriety, of thrift, of piety, when the world can end in a week? Historians still argue whether this profound sense of guilt and loss led to an increase in religious devotion among survivors, a desperate turning towards God for answers and solace, or if for many it precipitated a crisis of faith, a feeling of abandonment and disillusionment. Right now for you, it's a confusing mess of both. A part of you wants to fall to your knees and pray, to beg for understanding, for forgiveness, for the sin of surviving, but another, louder part of you screams, "What's the use? Where was God when Allah died? Where was he when Father Michael prayed his last?" You find yourself wandering back towards your own hut. The only place that still feels remotely like yours, though even it is tainted by the memory of your fever and the fear that clung to its walls. You look at the simple, meagre possessions. A wooden bowl, a worn blanket, a small carved bird your father made for you years ago. These objects, once just part of your daily life, now seem imbued with a terrible poignancy. They are the remnants of a life that no longer exists, a life shared with people who are gone. Each one is a testament to what has been lost, a tiny sharp pinprick of guilt. The thought occurs to you, perhaps you should have died, perhaps it would have been easier. The idea is shocking, the dark serpent coiling in your mind, but it's there nonetheless. To have succumbed with the others, to have avoided this empty, silent world, this crushing weight of being the one left behind. It's a selfish thought, perhaps even a wicked one. But the allure of oblivion, of an end to this torment, is undeniable. It's not a desire to die exactly, but a desperate wish that things had been different, that you hadn't been singled out for this lonely, agonizing fate. It's like being the last one picked for a team, but instead of a game, it's for a front row seat to the apocalypse and everyone else got to go home early. The guilt isn't just about being alive, it's about the burden of that life, the responsibility it seems to imply, a responsibility you feel utterly incapable of shouldering. You're a walking monument to their absence, and it's a heavy, heavy load to bear. The guilt, heavy as it is, begins to curdle into something else, something sharper and more unsettling, a profound questioning of everything you've ever been taught, everything you've ever believed about the divine, about the order of the universe. You sit on the stoop of your small hut, the sun now beginning its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows that seem to writhe and twist like tormented spirits. Where was God in all of this? This question, which had flickered at the edges of your grief, now burns at the center of your consciousness. All your life, you've been told that God is good, that God is just, that he watches over his flock. You've attended Mass, mumbled prayers, observed feast days and fast days. You've believed or tried to believe in a benevolent deity who rewards the faithful and punishes the wicked. But the plague makes a mockery of such beliefs. It struck down the pious and the sinner with equal terrifying impartiality. It took babes from their mothers' arms and devout priests from their altars. Little Arla, innocent and pure, was taken. Old man Hemlock, a grumbler but hardly a villain, was taken. Father Michael, who embodied Christian charity, was taken. Meanwhile, you, who have had your share of selfish thoughts and petty sins, are still here. What kind of divine justice is this? It feels less like the considered judgment of a loving father and more like the capricious whim of a cruel, indifferent giant swatting at ants for his amusement. You feel like a child who's just discovered that the fairy tales their parents told them aren't real. Only this isn't about a tooth fairy. It's about the very foundation of your existence. The church, the bedrock of medieval society, taught that suffering could be a test of faith or a punishment for sin. But the scale of this suffering, the sheer, indiscriminate horror of it, defies such neat explanations. If this was a punishment, what sin could possibly warrant such a devastating sentence upon an entire community, an entire continent? And if it was a test, what was the point if almost everyone failed by dying? The priests had offered prayers, led processions, urged repentance. None of it had worked. The litanies in the holy water were as useless against the pestilence as a paper shield against a sword. This shattering of faith wasn't just a personal crisis, it was a societal one. The Black Death caused many to question the efficacy and even the authority of the church, which had proven powerless to stop the onslaught. This is a well-documented historical fact. The plague significantly undermined the church's prestige and influence in the long term. paving the way for later religious reforms and a more secular worldview. You remember the frantic, desperate piety that gripped the village as the sickness first approached. People flocked to the church, confessed sins they hadn't even committed, promised extravagant donations if only they were spared. Some even undertook painful penances, hoping to appease an angry God. And for what? To die anyway, often in agony. Their prayers unanswered, their faith rewarded with a painful, terrifying demise. It feels like a betrayal. You look up at the sky, a vast, indifferent expanse of blue, and you want to scream at it to demand answers. But there's only silence. The same suffocating silence that fills the empty huts and the deserted green. A quirky, though tragic tidbit from this era is the rise in accusations of witchcraft and sorcery as people sought explanations for the inexplicable. If God wouldn't help, or if his actions were incomprehensible, then perhaps darker forces were at play. Some people in their terror and grief became convinced that the plague was the result of malevolent magic, of curses laid by witches or demons. It was easier perhaps to blame a tangible, albeit supernatural enemy than to accept the terrifying possibility of a random, meaningless universe or an indifferent God. You haven't reached that point of blaming witches, not yet. But the orderly, God-fearing world you once knew has definitely crumbled. Historians still argue whether the dominant spiritual response among survivors was a retreat into more personal, mystical forms of devotion, seeking a direct connection with God that bypassed the seemingly ineffective institutional church. Or if it led to widespread cynicism and a decline in religious observance altogether for you, it's a confusing void. The old prayers feel hollow, the rituals meaningless, the thought of stepping back into the village church, now likely empty or worse, a charnel house itself, fills you with a mixture of dread and a strange, bitter apathy. What comfort could its stone walls and dusty relics possibly offer now? The promises of salvation and eternal life ring hollow when juxtaposed with the fresh, gruesome reality of so much death. It's like being promised a feast while you're starving and then being served a plate of pebbles. The social and psychological impact of this crisis of faith was immense. If God's order was disrupted, then what about man's order? The hierarchies of feudal society, the divinely ordained roles of peasant, noble, and clergy. Did any of it still hold meaning when death, the great equalizer, had so thoroughly upended everything? Your own small life, once governed by the rhythms of the agricultural seasons and the dictates of the church calendar, now feels adrift, unmoored from any sense of purpose or divine plan. You're a tiny boat on a vast, dark ocean with no stars to guide you and no shore in sight. This isn't just a philosophical quandary, it's deeply personal. Your faith was a comfort, a framework for understanding your place in the world. Now that framework is shattered and you're left to pick through the pieces, trying to make sense of a reality that seems actively hostile to meaning. The world feels colder, emptier, and not just because of the missing people, but because of the missing certainty, the missing God. You feel a profound spiritual loneliness, an orphan not just of family and community, but of belief itself. The silence of the village is mirrored by the silence from the heavens. And it's a silence that chills you far more deeply than any winter wind. The sun dips below the tree line, painting the sky in bruised purples and bloody oranges, a fitting backdrop to the turmoil in your soul. As darkness creeps into the village, it brings with it not peace, but a sharpening of anxieties, the crisis of faith you're experiencing. That profound sense of divine abandonment doesn't exist in a vacuum. Human nature abhors a vacuum of explanation, especially when confronted with such overwhelming, inexplicable suffering. And so as the familiar reassurances of religion falter, the desperate human need to find someone or something to blame begins to take root, not just in your own mind, but as you will soon discover, in the minds of many survivors. It's a dangerous, poisonous seed. You huddle in your hut, the door barred, not against any tangible threat, but against the encroaching darkness and the phantoms of your own fear. You've eaten a little, a few stale crusts you found, But hunger is a distant concern compared to the gnawing unease. You think of other communities, other villages. Are they like yours, empty, or did some fare better? And if so, why? The randomness is maddening. If it wasn't God's will, then whose fault was it? The question hangs in the stale air of your hut, heavy and ominous. This desperate search for scapegoats is a tragically recurrent theme in times of widespread crisis, and the Black Death was no exception. The most prominent and horrific example of this was the persecution of Jewish communities across Europe. This is a grim historical fact. Baseless accusations that Jewish people had poisoned wells or deliberately spread the plague led to brutal massacres and expulsions in many towns and cities, particularly in the Rhineland and France. Despite papal bulls condemning these attacks and pointing out that Jewish communities were suffering from the plague just like Christian ones, the hysteria fueled by pre-existing anti-Semitism and the desperate need for a culprit often proved unstoppable. You haven't encountered any Jewish people in your small, isolated village, but you've heard the stories, the whispers carried by traveling merchants or wandering friars, tales of outsiders, of heretics, of those who don't conform being eyed with suspicion, then hatred, then violence. It's a terrifying thought that the shared trauma of the plague, instead of uniting people in their suffering, could actually tear them apart, driving them to commit further atrocities in their fear and ignorance. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the evening air. If people are looking for someone to blame, who might they turn on if there are no obvious outsiders? The woman who collects herbs and is rumored to know more than she should. The quiet man who keeps to himself. Anyone different. Anyone vulnerable. It wasn't just Jewish communities, though they bore the brunt of this scapegoating. A quirky or rather deeply disturbing fringe tidbit is that in some areas, people with skin conditions like leprosy or even severe acne were targeted. Their visible afflictions were sometimes twisted into signs of internal corruption or divine displeasure, making them easy targets for a populace desperate to find a tangible cause for their suffering. Imagine surviving the plague only to be stoned or driven out of your home because of a birthmark or a persistent rash. The sheer injustice is staggering. It's like society, having been punched by an invisible force, decides to punch itself in the face in retaliation. Historians still argue whether these scapegoating events were primarily driven by popular hysteria from below, a spontaneous outpouring of fear and rage, or if they were often cynically instigated or manipulated by authorities from above, nobles or city councils looking to deflect popular anger, seize property, or consolidate their own power. Perhaps it was a grim combination of both. Regardless of the precise mechanisms, the outcome was the same. Innocent people suffered and died not from the plague itself, but at the hands of their fellow human beings. As you sit in the darkness, the silence of your village now feels pregnant with a new kind of menace. It's one thing to face an impersonal, invisible disease. It's another entirely to contemplate the cruelty that fear can unlock in human hearts. What if other survivors from nearby hamlets that were also hit stumble upon your village? Would they see you as a fellow sufferer or as a potential threat? Someone who inexplicably lived when their own loved ones died. Could your survival itself make you a target of suspicion? Why him? What did he do? Is he unnatural? It's a truly awful thought that the very fact of your existence could be twisted into an accusation. You think about the stories you heard before the plague reached your quiet corner of the world. Tales from the cities where tensions ran high, rumors of foreigners being blamed, of beggars being driven out, of anyone perceived as different becoming a focus for fear and hatred. It's a primal, ugly instinct, this need to cast out the other to purify the community, to find a sacrifice that will appease the angry gods or fate or whatever monstrous force they believe is responsible. It's almost as if by finding and punishing a scapegoat, people could regain a sense of control in a world that had spun terrifyingly out of it. It's a false sense of control, of course, a temporary salve built on injustice and cruelty. But in times of extreme desperation, Even false hope can be a powerful motivator. The wind picks up outside, rattling the ill-fitting shutters of your window, making the shadows dance more frantically. Each gust sounds like a whisper, a rumor, a potential accusation. You're alone, isolated, and suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable. Not just to the lingering possibility of disease, but to the potential madness of other survivors. The world outside your barred door, once familiar and predictable, now seems fraught with new human-made dangers. The plague killed the body, but you realize with a dawning horror that the fear it engendered could kill the soul of society itself, turning neighbor against neighbor in a desperate, tragic search for someone, anyone, to blame for the nightmare. The night passes in a fitful, fear-laced doze. You wake often, startled by the hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small creature outside, your heart pounding, convinced for a terrifying moment that the coughs and cries have returned. But each time, the oppressive silence of the dead village reasserts itself. When the first grey light of dawn finally seeps through the cracks in your shutters, it brings not relief, but a dull, aching weariness and the stark realization of a new, pressing problem. Hunger. The stale crusts from yesterday are long gone, and the gnawing emptiness in your stomach is becoming a persistent, demanding companion, almost as unwelcome as the fear and guilt. You unbar your door and step outside, the morning air cool and damp. The village is as you left it, a silent testament to an unimaginable catastrophe. But today, your focus shifts. The immediate visceral horror of the bodies, while still present, is overlaid by a more practical, primal concern. You need food, and not just for today. If you are to survive beyond the next few days, you need to find a sustainable source. Your own small vegetable patch behind your hut is untended, choked with weeds. Its meager offerings probably raided by desperate hands, or simply withered on the vine before the plague even struck you down. The village's communal grain stores, if any, remain, are an unknown. Who managed them? Who holds the key? Are they even intact? As you walk through the village, your eyes now scan for signs of sustenance, not just signs of death. The baker's cottage stands silent, its ovens cold for weeks. The small livestock pens behind various huts are mostly empty, their gates ajar. A few scrawny chickens still peck in the dirt, but they look as starved as you feel. Capturing them would be an effort, and they wouldn't last long. What you need is grain, preserved meats, anything that can be stored. This devastation of the agricultural workforce is a critical consequence of the plague. The historical fact is that the Black Death led to widespread abandonment of fields and a drastic reduction in cultivated land because there simply weren't enough people left to work it. This in turn led to recurrent famines and food shortages for decades afterwards, even for those who survived the disease itself. It wasn't just a short-term crisis, it was a long-term agricultural catastrophe. You remember the rhythm of the seasons, the planting and the harvest, the lifeblood of your community, all that is gone. The fields that should be ripening with wheat or barley are likely untended, overgrown, their bounty left to rot or be eaten by birds. The shepherd who looked after the village flock is gone. The miller who ground the grain is gone. The entire intricate system of food production and distribution has collapsed. You are on your own, a solitary forager in a world that has forgotten how to feed itself. It's like living in a giant abandoned supermarket where all the fresh produce is spoiled and you have to rummage through the back rooms hoping to find a forgotten can of something, anything. You approach what was once the Reeves house. He was responsible for overseeing the ville's agricultural work, for collecting dues for the lord of the manor. Perhaps there's a storehouse nearby. The door hangs crookedly on one hinge. You push it open, calling out tentatively, "Hello, anyone here?" Only silence answers, heavy with the familiar, cloying scent of decay. You step inside, your eyes adjusting to the gloom. The small cottage is in disarray, overturned furniture, scattered belongings. It looks as if it was ransacked, or perhaps its occupants fell ill too quickly to maintain any semblance of order. In a small attached shed, You find a few sacks. Your heart leaps, then sinks. 2 are empty, gnawed by rats. The third contains a pitiful amount of mouldy grain, shot through with weevils, useless. The quirky or rather desperate tidbit here is that some historical accounts mention survivors resorting to eating things they would never have considered before: cats, dogs, rats. Ironic, given their role in spreading the plague, tree bark, and even in the most extreme and horrifying cases, the bodies of the dead. Cannibalism driven by famine was a rare but not unheard of horror in the medieval period, especially during sieges or extreme environmental collapses. You shudder at the thought, pushing it firmly from your mind. You're not there yet. But the gnawing hunger makes the boundary between civilized behavior and desperate survival feel alarmingly thin. Historians still argue about the exact timeline and severity of these post-plague famines in different regions. Some areas recovered their agricultural output relatively quickly due to various factors, while others suffered prolonged periods of scarcity. The impact was uneven depending on local conditions, the severity of depopulation, and the resilience of the surviving communities. For you, in your isolated, depopulated village, the outlook seems bleak. There are no bustling markets to visit, no merchants bringing grain from afar. The world has shrunk to the limits of what you can find with your own 2 hands. You move on, cottage by cottage, a grim scavenger. Most often, nothing but sorrow and the stench of death. In one, you find a small cask of ale, miraculously untouched. It's weak and slightly sour, but it's liquid, and the meager calories it offers are welcome. In another, tucked away in a clay pot, you discover a handful of dried beans, hard as pebbles. Not much, but it's something. Each small find is a tiny victory against the encroaching despair, a brief respite from the gnawing hunger. But it's not enough, not for the long term. The fields surrounding the village, once a patchwork of carefully tended strips, now look wild, neglected. You walk out to the edge of one where barley was planted. Much of it has been flattened by rain or eaten by birds, but here and there you see heads of grain still clinging to the stalks. It would be back-breaking work to harvest it by hand, stalk by stalk, and then you'd need to thresh it, winnow it, grind it. Tasks usually done by many hands with specialized tools. You feel a wave of despair. The food is there in theory, but it's almost out of reach, guarded by the sheer effort required to obtain it. It's like seeing a rescue ship on the horizon, only to realize you have no way to signal it or swim that far. The untended fields are a potent symbol of your predicament. Nature's bounty rendered inaccessible by the collapse of human society. The silence of the fields, once broken by the songs of workers, now seems to mock your hunger. The discovery of those few dried beans and the cask of sour ale, while momentarily uplifting, does little to solve your long-term problem of sustenance. As you continue your grim survey of the village, the broader implications of the catastrophe begin to crystallize. It's not just about food for yourself, it's about everything that made daily life function. The intricate web of skills and labor that kept your small world turning has been utterly shredded. You stand in the center of the deserted village green, the silence pressing in, and you realize the profound truth. The hands are missing, all the hands that did all the work. Think of the blacksmith. His forge stands cold, the bellows gathering dust, his hammers and tongs lying where he last dropped them. Who will shoe the horses now, if any horses even remain? Who will mend the plows, sharpen the tools, create the nails and hinges that hold your world together? You remember his strong arms, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a sound so integral to the village soundscape that you barely noticed it until it was gone. Now its absence is deafening. If your only shovel breaks or your knife dulls, there is no one to repair or replace it. Simple tasks will become monumental challenges. Then there's the miller. His watermill down by the stream is silent. Its great wheel still. The sacks of grain you might eventually scavenge from the fields will be useless unless they can be ground into flour. Pounding grain by hand with a stone is an exhausting, inefficient process, yielding only a coarse, gritty meal. The miller's expertise, his knowledge of the machinery, the precise adjustments needed to produce fine flour, all gone. You recall his dusty clothes, his perpetually flour-whitened eyebrows, and the way he'd grumble good-naturedly about the quality of everyone's grain. Now you'd give anything for a sack of his worst. Most complained about flour. What about the weaver who turned raw wool into cloth for your tunics and blankets? The loom in her cottage is threaded with an unfinished piece, a silent testament to an interrupted life. Who will make new cloth when your current rags fall apart? Spinning and weaving are skilled, time-consuming crafts, or the tanner, whose unpleasant but essential work provided leather for shoes, belts, and harnesses. His pits, located at the edge of the village, for obvious olfactory reasons, are likely untended, the contents putrefying. Without him, you'll be walking barefoot once your current shoes give out, and repairing anything made of leather will be impossible. Is like a complex machine where dozens of crucial cogs have suddenly vanished. The machine doesn't just run poorly, it doesn't run at all. This crippling labor shortage was one of the most immediate and far-reaching consequences of the Black Death. Historical records from across Europe detail the desperate scramble for workers in all sectors. Lords couldn't find enough peasants to till their lands, monasteries couldn't find enough lay brothers to manage their estates, and towns couldn't find enough artisans to keep essential trades going. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental threat to the socio-economic order. You're living the very beginning of this crisis, the stark, personal reality of it. You think of the women's work, often less visible but no less vital. Who will bake the bread even if you find flour? Who will tend the sick if anyone else falls ill? Who will manage the dairying if any cows survived? Who will brew the ale, a staple of the medieval diet? So many of these tasks shared among the women of the village are now left undone. You remember the communal baking oven, the chatter and warmth as women gathered with their dough. Now it's just another cold, silent structure. The quirky and rather poignant tidbit here is that some medieval guilds, which were almost exclusively male, were forced to allow widows to carry on their deceased husbands' trades simply because there was no one else to do the work. It was a small, often temporary crack in the rigid gender roles of the time, born entirely of desperation and the overwhelming lack of manpower. Historians still argue about the precise speed and extent to which these labor shortages impacted different regions and different sectors of the economy. Some argue that the agricultural sector was hit hardest and recovered slowest, while others point to the severe disruption in urban crafts and trade. But for you, standing in your silent village, the debate is academic. Every single aspect of life that depended on another person's labor is now compromised. Even the most basic things, fetching water from the well, gathering firewood, become more daunting when you realize there's no one to share the load, no one to help if you fall ill or injure yourself. The social fabric hasn't just been torn, it's been vaporized. You recall how neighbors would help each other during harvest time, or if a roof needed mending. That collective support system is gone. If your hut's roof starts to leak, you'll have to fix it yourself, assuming you even know how and can find the materials. There's no one to ask for help, no one to lend a hand. The sense of isolation is profound, not just emotionally, but practically. It's the terrifying realization that you're solely responsible for every aspect of your own survival. In a world where survival was always a communal effort, you look at your own hands again. They feel small, inadequate, unskilled in so many of the arts that kept life going. You can mend a net, perhaps, and you know a little about foraging for herbs, but can you build a weatherproof shelter from scratch? Can you hunt successfully with no proper weapons? Can you preserve food for the winter without the knowledge passed down through generations? The missing hands are not just an economic problem, they are an existential one. Each missing artisan, each missing laborer is a missing piece of the collective knowledge and skill that your community once possessed. You are left with fragments and the daunting task of trying to rebuild a life, or at least sustain one with so many essential pieces gone forever. The village, once a hive of activity, is now a museum of lost skills, a monument to a forgotten workforce. The chilling realization of the missing hands, the vanished skills, leads directly to another looming spectre, the utter collapse of the local economy, however rudimentary it might have been in your small village. You sit by the cold hearth in your hut, gnawing on one of the hard, dry beans you found, and contemplate the value of things. Yesterday, a silver penny could buy you a loaf of bread, perhaps a small measure of ale. Today, what is a silver penny worth when the baker is dead and the brewer gone? You might have a few coins hidden away, a tiny emergency stash, but who would you give them to? And for what? The very concept of money feels absurd in this empty world. The few chickens you've seen, scrawny as they are suddenly more valuable than any silver. A pot, a knife, a good blanket. These are the new treasures, their worth measured not in currency, but in their immediate utility for survival. The finely crafted buckle on a dead man's belt, once a mark of status, is now just a piece of metal. Perhaps useful if you can repurpose it, but its monetary value has evaporated. This isn't just a village problem. The Black Death triggered severe economic disruption across Europe. One of the most significant historical facts is the dramatic and often chaotic fluctuation in prices and wages. Initially, with so many goods perishing or becoming unavailable due to lack of production and transport, the price of necessities like grain often skyrocketed. Later, as labor became scarce, wages for surviving workers would eventually rise. But this transition was far from smooth or uniform. You wander over to what was the small, informal market space on the village green. Here, on a good week, a travelling peddler might have set up selling ribbons, salt, or cheap trinkets. Villagers might have bartered eggs for milk or a mended tool for a share of a catch of fish. Now the space is haunted by absence. The idea of trade seems almost laughable. Trade requires goods and people to produce and exchange them. You have a dwindling supply of your own life and little else to offer. If another survivor were to stumble into this village, what would you trade with them? A handful of weevilly beans for what? Their own meager scavenged supplies. It would be a desperate exchange born of mutual poverty. The value of land, too, has become a twisted concept. Before owning or having rights to a good strip of arable land was the foundation of wealth and survival. Now there is land of plenty, vast tracts of it suddenly ownerless, tenantless. But land is only valuable if it can be worked, if its produce can be harvested and consumed or sold. Untended land is just wilderness, waiting to reclaim its territory. The manorial lord who lived miles away and only visited occasionally to collect his dues now notionally owns even more land by default, as his tenants have died. But what good is it to him without the peasants to farm it? It's like owning 1,000 magnificent horses with no one to ride or care for them. They are just a field of beautiful, useless animals. You recall the importance of coin for paying taxes, tithes to the church, and rent to the manor. Now, with the collectors likely dead and the institutions they represented in disarray, those obligations seem distant, almost unreal. But if some semblance of order is ever restored, what then? Will they demand back payments from the few starved wretches who remain? The thought is almost darkly comical. Yes, Lord Baron, I'll gladly pay you 3 years of back rent for this hovel and these corpse-strewn fields. Would you prefer your payment in flies or despair? A quirky and telling economic indicator from the post-plague era is found in the price of luxury goods versus essentials. While the cost of grain might soar, the price of some luxury items actually dropped for a time as the wealthy elites who typically consumed them died off, leading to a glut in the market for things like fine silks or elaborate jewelry. Of course, this was of no consequence to someone like you whose primary concern is finding enough calories to see the next sunrise. The idea of a luxury good now is finding a tinderbox that still has a few flints. Historians still argue about the long-term net effect of these economic shifts. Did the massive depopulation ultimately lead to a higher standard of living for the surviving peasantry due to increased wages and more available land per capita? Or did the ensuing instability, inflation, and recurrent plagues negate these potential benefits for many decades? The answer is complex and varies greatly by region and social class. For you, in the immediate aftermath, there are no benefits. There is only the stark reality of scarcity and the breakdown of all familiar economic interactions. The concept of a fair price is meaningless when there are no sellers, no buyers, and nothing much to sell. You look at the few coins you possess, perhaps a couple of silver pennies and a few groats, painstakingly saved. They feel cold and heavy in your palm. Inert symbols of a system that no longer functions. You can't eat them, you can't wear them, you can't use them to mend your roof. Their power, their perceived value, was always a collective agreement, a social construct, and the society that underwrote that agreement is, for all intents and purposes, dead. You're back to a barter economy, but one where everyone is destitute. It's a sobering thought. All the gold in the king's treasury would be worthless to you right now, compared to a sack of good flour or a side of salted pork. The world has been stripped bare, and in its nakedness the true value of things, food, shelter, tools, skills, becomes brutally, undeniably clear. Your coins are just small, round pieces of metal. Reminders of a world where bread wasn't dear because it was scarce, but because you lacked the specific tokens to acquire it. Now bread is beyond dear. It's practically a myth. Days, perhaps a week, blur into a monotonous cycle of scavenging, fear, and profound loneliness. You've managed to find a little more food, some withered vegetables in an abandoned garden, a small sack of oats heavily infested with mice, but edible if you're not too fussy. Each sunrise brings the same chilling silence, the same vistas of desolation. But as the immediate shock begins to wear off and the gnawing hunger is kept barely at bay, a new understanding starts to dawn. A subtle shift in the power dynamics of this shattered world, even if you are its only current inhabitant. The old order, the rigid hierarchy that defined everyone's place from birth to death, is crumbling, not just in your village, but as you will eventually learn, across the land. Peasants are rising, not in violent rebellion, though that will come later, but in their newfound, grimly acquired value. Lords are falling not from their horses in battle, but from their pedestals of unquestioned authority. You sit on a fallen log at the edge of the village, looking out over the untended fields. Before the plague, this land belonged to the manor lord. You and everyone else in this village were his tenants, his serfs, bound to this land, obligated to work his fields for a set number of days each week, to give him a share of your own meager harvest, to pay him dues and fines for countless infractions, real or imagined. Your life was circumscribed by his will, by ancient customs that kept you and yours firmly at the bottom of the social ladder. Now, where is the Lord? Is he even alive? And if he is, who will enforce his will here? You are the only one left. The Lord's power, you realize, was never truly in his noble blood or his fancy title. It was in the peasants who worked his land and feared his authority. Without them, he is just a man, perhaps with a larger house and finer clothes, but fundamentally as helpless as anyone else if he cannot command labor. This dawning awareness of the peasants' potential power is a crucial historical outcome of the Black Death. With populations decimated, labor became an incredibly scarce and valuable commodity. For the first time in centuries, surviving peasants found themselves in a position to negotiate, to demand better conditions, higher wages, or freedom from the most onerous feudal obligations. Lords, desperate to have their lands cultivated and their harvests brought in, were often forced to concede. This marked the beginning of the end for traditional serfdom in many parts of Western Europe. It wasn't an overnight revolution, but a slow, grinding shift in the balance of power. You imagine the Lord's Reeve if he had survived and dared to return, trying to order you about. "You peasant, why are these fields untended? Get to work." Before, such a command would have been met with grudging obedience. Now you almost laugh. You, the sole survivor, the only pair of hands for miles, capable of any agricultural labor, you would be the one dictating terms. Work your own fields, Master Reeve. Or perhaps you'd like to offer me, say, triple the usual wage, and that cottage by the stream, the one with the good thatch, that will be mine, free and clear. It's a heady, almost treasonous thought, but it's rooted in a new, stark reality. Your sweat, your muscle, your mere existence has become immensely valuable. It's a grim sort of promotion earned by outliving everyone else. A quirky and illustrative detail from this period is the recorded instance of some English villagers collectively bargaining with their lord, threatening to leave and seek better terms on a neighbouring manor if their demands for reduced rents and services were not met. Such an act of collective defiance would have been almost unthinkable before the plague. It demonstrates a newfound confidence and awareness of their own worth among the peasantry. They were no longer easily replaceable cogs in a vast agricultural machine. They were the machine itself, or what was left of it. Historians still argue about the extent to which this newfound peasant agency was a conscious, organized movement versus a series of localized, opportunistic responses to changing economic conditions. Was it a true class consciousness emerging, or simply individuals making rational choices in a radically altered marketplace for labor? Probably a bit of both, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. The rigid bonds of feudalism were being loosened, not by royal decree or philosophical enlightenment, but by the grim reaper's scythe. You think of the generations before you, toiling on this same land, their lives little better than those of beasts of burden, tied to the soil, subject to the whims of their masters. They lived and died without ever questioning the fundamental unfairness of it all, because that was simply the way things were, ordained by God and custom. Now, custom is broken, and God, if he is still watching, seems to have bigger things on his mind. The sheer scale of death has wiped the slate clean in many ways, forcing a re-evaluation of everything, including who owes what to whom. You are, in a strange and terrifying way, free. Free from the daily grind of obligatory labor for a distant master, free from the petty tyrannies of the reeve, free from the endless cycle of debt and subservience that defined peasant life. But it's a terrifying freedom. The freedom of a castaway on a desert island. What do you do with it? You are lord of all you survey, but your kingdom is a graveyard. Your subjects, the silent dead and the indifferent wildlife. Still, the thought that you're no longer anyone's property, no longer bound by invisible chains to this particular patch of earth, is a powerful one. If you could find other survivors, a community rebuilding elsewhere, perhaps you could offer your labor on your own terms as a free man, not a serf. The idea is both exhilarating and terrifying. The old world is dead, and the new one, whatever it may be, has rules that are yet to be written. And perhaps, just perhaps, you might have a say in writing them. This is a far cry from the back-breaking, thankless toil that was your birthright. The world has been turned upside down, and for a peasant like you, that might not be entirely a bad thing once the initial horror subsides, if you can survive the starvation and the loneliness, that is, the heady, almost dizzying notion that your labor now has real value, that you're no longer just a pair of hands to be commanded, but an asset to be courted, begins to settle in your mind. It's a strange counterpoint to the grief and desolation, a tiny spark of agency in a world that has rendered you otherwise powerless. If you were to leave this ghostly village, if you were to find a place where society, however battered, still functioned, what would that mean? It means that workers, the few who remain, can make demands. This isn't just a fleeting thought. It's the logical extension of the catastrophic labor shortage you've witnessed firsthand. Imagine encountering a desperate landowner, his fields choked with weeds, his granaries empty, his few remaining servants listless and overworked. He sees you reasonably healthy, clearly capable of work. Before the plague, he might have offered you the barest subsistence wage, a place in a drafty outbuilding, and the expectation of unquestioning obedience. Now the tables have turned. You are the scarce commodity. You could, in theory, name your price. A decent cottage, not a hovel. Good food and plenty of it. Meat twice a week, not just on feast days. And no more Harriet tax when my father dies, if I ever find a wife, and have a son, that is. These would have been audacious, almost unthinkable demands just a year ago. Now they might just be met because the alternative for the landowner is ruin. This newfound bargaining power of labor is a well-documented historical consequence of the Black Death. Across Europe, surviving peasants and urban laborers began to demand and often receive significantly higher wages. They also sought more favorable terms of employment, such as shorter contracts, greater freedom of movement, and the commutation of labor services into cash payments. This period saw the enactment of laws like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict peasant mobility. The very fact that such laws were deemed necessary is powerful evidence of the pressure workers were exerting on the ruling classes. The cat was out of the bag, or rather the serf was off the manor, and it was proving very difficult to get him back under the old terms. You picture yourself walking into a town, if you can find one that hasn't suffered the same fate as your village. You see artisans, workshops shuttered, not for lack of customers, but for lack of artisans. A master craftsman desperate for an apprentice, or even just a strong back to help with unskilled tasks, might overlook your lack of formal training and offer you a position that would have been unthinkable before. Can you carry that? Can you follow simple instructions? Good enough, you're hired. And here's a signing bonus of $1. Well, how about a pair of nearly new boots and a hot meal every day? It's a seller's market for labor, and you, by virtue of drawing breath, are a seller. You might even get to choose your employer, a concept utterly alien to your previous life, where your lord was chosen for you by birth. A quirky and somewhat amusing manifestation of this shift can be seen in contemporary complaints from the nobility and clergy about the arrogance and uppityness of the surviving lower classes. Chronicles lament that servants were no longer content with simple food and rough clothing, but demanded fine white bread, ale, and even silk trimmings. They were accused of being lazy, grasping, and disrespectful of their betters. It's the classic lament of an elite class losing its accustomed privileges and finding it deeply unsettling. They were in essence complaining that the help was getting too expensive and too demanding. A timeless grievance, really, but one given a powerful new impetus by the plague. It's like your great-aunt complaining that kids these days just don't appreciate how good they have it. Except kids these days were holding all the economic cards. Historians still argue about the long-term success of measures like the Statute of Labourers. While such laws aimed to suppress wages and control peasant movement, their enforcement was often patchy and inconsistent. The sheer economic forces at play, the desperate need for workers, often proved stronger than legislative attempts to hold back the tide. Did these laws ultimately fail? Many argue yes, pointing to the continued rise in real wages for labourers throughout the latter half of the 14th century. Others suggest they may have slowed the process or created regional variations. For you, the theoretical peasant, the existence of such laws would be a clear sign that your newfound leverage is real and is scaring the people in charge. That in itself is a form of power. This potential for better wages and conditions isn't just about material comfort. It's about dignity. It's about having some control over your own life, your own labor. To be able to refuse work that is too demeaning or dangerous. To negotiate for a fair return for your efforts. To perhaps even save a little. To have choices. These are radical concepts for someone raised in the rigid certainties of feudalism. The thought is both liberating and a little frightening. With choice comes responsibility and the risk of making the wrong choice. Of course, this is all hypothetical as you sit in your silent, empty village. First, you have to survive. You have to find other people. You have to navigate a world that is still reeling and dangerous. But the knowledge that if you do make it out, your life might not have to be the same grinding servitude as your ancestors' lives is a powerful motivator. It's a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The world has been shattered, yes, but perhaps in the rebuilding, there's a chance for a slightly better, slightly fairer place for those who were once at the very bottom. The traditional masters might not like it. They might legislate against it. They might call you arrogant and greedy, but they need you. And that, you realize with a surge of grim satisfaction, changes everything. Your hands, once just tools for their enrichment, are now your greatest bargaining chip. The sun rises on another day of scavenging, another day of wrestling with the ghosts of what was and the terrifying uncertainty of what will be. As you pick through the deserted cottages, searching for overlooked scraps of food or useful tools, your mind inevitably turns to the human cost, not just in terms of numbers, but in the unraveling of families and households. What has become of the children whose parents succumbed? Who is caring for the orphans, if any survived? And what of the properties, the homes, the small plots of land like this one you currently inhabit? Who owns them now? The plague didn't just leave bodies. It left a legacy of countless orphans and a bewildering tangle of empty manors and unclaimed inheritances. You remember the families in your village, the Cooper, John, and his wife Martha, with their 3 boisterous children. Little Arla, whose memory still brings a pang to your heart. Thomas, the young farmer, who was newly married to sweet Mary from the next village. Are any of them left? If a child survived but their parents did not, what hope would they have? A small child alone in this silent, predatory world would not last long. Even an older child strong enough to scavenge would be incredibly vulnerable. The thought of children wandering lost and terrified, their protectors gone, is a particularly sharp kind of horror. It's one thing to contemplate your own solitary struggle. It's another to imagine the terror of a child facing it. The sheer number of orphans created by the Black Death was a societal crisis in itself. This is a stark historical fact. Communities and institutions across Europe struggled to cope with the sudden influx of parentless children. Existing orphanages, often run by religious orders, were quickly overwhelmed. New solutions had to be found, often ad hoc and inadequate. Sometimes surviving relatives would take in orphaned kin, but often entire families were wiped out, leaving no one to assume responsibility. Guilds might take on the orphaned children of their members as apprentices, but this could only absorb a small fraction. Many were simply left to fend for themselves, swelling the ranks of beggars and vagrants. You come across a small, crudely carved wooden doll lying in the dusty doorway of a cottage. It's a simple thing worn smooth by tiny hands. You pick it up, a wave of sadness washing over you. Whose child did this belong to? Did they die clutching it, or did they drop it in their flight or in the delirium of fever? Such small, poignant remnants of lost lives are everywhere. Constant reminders of the severed bonds of family. You can almost hear the echo of children's laughter, now horribly silent. It's like walking through a nursery after all the babies have inexplicably vanished, leaving only their toys and tiny shoes behind. A quirky, though ultimately sad detail from some medieval records describes how in the immediate aftermath of the plague, some surviving children formed feral gangs roaming the countryside, stealing food to survive. Lacking adult guidance and protection, they reverted to a more primal state, a lost generation, forced to mature too quickly or perish. It's a grim picture, these small bands of desperate children navigating a world that had utterly failed them. You wonder if any such groups are out there now in the woods beyond your village, watching, waiting. Historians still argue about the long-term social impact of this massive orphaning event. Did it lead to a breakdown in social order and an increase in crime, as some contemporaries feared? Or did it paradoxically create new opportunities for social mobility for some of these unattached young people who were not bound by traditional family ties and obligations? Perhaps it did both. The records are often too sparse to draw firm conclusions for every region. But the disruption to family structures was undeniably profound and had repercussions for generations. And then there are the properties. Every empty hut in this village, every untended strip of land, theoretically belongs to someone. But who? If the entire family that lived in a cottage died, who inherits distant cousins they never knew? The lord of the manor. By default, the church. The legal chaos in the plague's aftermath was immense. Courts were overwhelmed with inheritance disputes, claims and counterclaims. Wills, if they existed, were often contested or rendered invalid by the deaths of all named beneficiaries and witnesses. It was a lawyer's nightmare, or perhaps a lawyer's dream, depending on their disposition. You look around at the silent, empty cottages. Legally, you have no claim to any of them beyond the hut you occupied before the sickness. But with no one left to dispute it, you could, in theory, take over the largest, most well-built house in the village. You could claim the best fields. Who would stop you? The concept of ownership, like the concept of money, feels strangely fluid, almost meaningless in this vacuum of authority. Possession is 9/10 of the law, the old saying goes. Well, right now possession is pretty much the entire law, and you were the only one here to possess anything. The issue of empty manors was particularly acute for the nobility. Entire noble lines were extinguished, their estates left vacant or falling into the hands of distant, sometimes unsuitable heirs. This led to a concentration of land in fewer hands in some areas and a fragmentation of estates in others. It also created opportunities for those with new wealth, perhaps merchants or successful yeomen, to buy their way into the landed gentry, further blurring the old social distinctions. The plague was a brutal reshuffler of the deck, and property was one of the main cards in play. The idea that you, a simple peasant, could even contemplate owning property in any meaningful sense beyond your immediate desperate need for shelter is a testament to how radically the world has changed. These silent, empty houses are more than just sad reminders of lost lives. They are symbols of a society unraveling at its most fundamental level, the level of family and inheritance. Days meld into a solitary routine, rise with the weak sun, scavenge for anything edible or useful. Check the snares you've crudely fashioned, mostly empty, and try to ignore the ever-present ache of loneliness and the low hum of fear. The physical exertion keeps the worst of the despair at bay. But in the quiet moments, when you're huddled by a tiny fire trying to coax warmth into your chilled bones, the what-ifs return with a vengeance. What if the plague comes back? What if you get sick from some other ailment, a simple fever or an infected wound with no one to help? The desperate need for some kind of protection, some remedy, however irrational, becomes almost overwhelming. And you know from scraps of conversation and shared anxieties before your village fell silent that you're not alone in this desperate grasping for solutions. You start to recall the bizarre and often terrifying cures and preventative measures that people talked about or even tried. As the plague crept closer, the air was thick with fear and equally thick with charlatans and well-meaning but utterly misguided advice. You remember a traveling doctor, a man with shifty eyes and stained robes, selling expensive potions made from ground gemstones and exotic herbs promising immunity. He probably made a fortune before either succumbing himself or wisely disappearing. Then there were the more common folk remedies, drinking vinegar, bathing in urine, yours or an animal's. Opinions varied apparently, or carrying strong-smelling concoctions of garlic, rue, and wormwood. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about in another context? Well, some medieval plague cures weren't far off in their sheer unpleasantness and lack of efficacy. One of the mainstream historical facts about medieval medicine in the face of the plague is its almost complete helplessness. Doctors relying on Galenic theories of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and the idea of miasma, bad air, had no real understanding of contagion or infection in the way we do. Their Treatments often involved bloodletting to rebalance the humours, which likely weakened patients further, lancing the buboes, painful and probably spread infection, and prescribing complex herbal mixtures whose effects were at best negligible. They were fighting an invisible enemy with entirely inappropriate weapons. Is like trying to put out a house fire with a feather duster. You find yourself eyeing certain plants with suspicion or a flicker of desperate hope. That patch of St. John's wort growing near the abandoned church. Was that one of the herbs said to ward off evil and by extension disease? Or was it plantain crushed and applied as a poultice? The knowledge once shared and debated in the village is now fragmented in your memory, unreliable and tinged with a bitter taste of failure. You remember someone suggesting that smelling deeply from a latrine pit each morning could acclimatize the body to foul airs and thus protect it. You shudder at the thought, but a tiny, desperate part of your mind wonders if there could be any truth to such a desperate measure. Probably not, you conclude. The only thing that would acclimatize you to is the smell of, well, you know. This desperation led to some truly quirky and fringe beliefs and practices. For instance, there were tales of people wearing amulets containing arsenic or mercury, believing these potent poisons could somehow scare away the poison of the plague. Others relied on complex astrological calculations to determine auspicious times to travel or to perform certain actions, hoping to align themselves with favorable celestial influences. And then there was the belief in the power of sound. Some communities rang church bells continuously day and night, hoping the vibrations would drive away the pestilential air. Others engaged in loud shouting or the banging of pots and pans for the same reason. It's a poignant image. A village full of people, terrified and helpless, making as much noise as possible to fight an enemy they couldn't see or understand. Historians still argue about the psychological function of these seemingly irrational remedies. Were they purely a result of ignorance and superstition, or did they provide a crucial, albeit illusory, sense of agency and hope in a situation where people felt utterly powerless? By performing these rituals, by taking these potions, perhaps individuals felt they were at least doing something rather than passively awaiting their fate. In a world without scientific explanations, any action, however bizarre, might have felt preferable to inaction. You find yourself becoming more observant of your own body than ever before. Every itch, every twinge, every unusual sensation sends a jolt of anxiety through you. You check your armpits and groin compulsively for any sign of swelling. You analyze the color of your tongue, the consistency of your well, never mind. You become your own suspicious, hypervigilant physician, armed with nothing but fear and half-remembered folklore. You even consider trying one of the more outlandish preventative measures you'd heard about, perhaps holding a lucky stone you found by the river, or muttering a charm a supposed wise woman had once sold your mother. It feels foolish, childish even, but the terror is a powerful persuader. The search for a magical bullet, a secret antidote, is a natural human response to overwhelming threat. But in this case, all the amulets, potions, and bizarre rituals were just whistling in the dark. The plague bacteria cared not a whit for your lucky stone or your carefully recited charm. It continued its relentless march, indifferent to human attempts to bargain with or ward it off through magical means. This powerlessness, this utter failure of all known remedies, sacred or profane, must have been terrifying. It would have stripped away another layer of certainty, another comforting illusion that humans had some measure of control over their lives and their environment. All you can do is try to eat, try to stay warm and pray. Though to whom and with what hope you're increasingly unsure that you don't fall sick again, because this time there will be truly no one. The days continue their bleak procession, each one a small victory of survival, yet each overshadowed by the lingering trauma and the oppressive silence. As you range further in your desperate search for sustenance, perhaps venturing towards a neighboring, equally deserted hamlet, or following a half-forgotten track through the woods, you might encounter a sight that would chill you to the bone. A stark manifestation of the extreme religious fervor and terror that the plague unleashed, the flagellants. These processions of self-scourging penitents were a horrifying, yet not uncommon spectacle in plague-stricken Europe. Imagine cresting a small hill and seeing them in the distance, a straggling column of figures moving slowly across the blighted landscape. As they draw closer, the sounds reach you first, a low rhythmic chanting interspersed with the sickening wet thud of whips on flesh and the groans and cries of the participants. Then you see them clearly. Men mostly, though sometimes women too, stripped to the waist, their backs a criss-crossed mess of bloody welts and open wounds. They walk barefoot, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and ecstatic religious zeal. They carry heavy crosses and many wield fearsome scourges, often with multiple leather thongs tipped with iron or bone, which they bring down upon their own backs with horrifying regularity. It's a parade of public suffering, a desperate, bloody offering to an apparently wrathful god. The flagellant movement was a recurring phenomenon in the medieval period, often flaring up in times of crisis, but it reached its zenith during the Black Death. This is a well-established historical fact. Groups of flagellants, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or even thousands, would travel from town to town performing public rituals of penance. They believed that by mortifying their own flesh, by taking upon themselves extreme suffering, they could atone for the sins of mankind and persuade God to lift the plague. Their processions were highly theatrical, designed to inspire awe, fear, and repentance in onlookers. They would often enter a town, circle the church, and then perform their ritual scourging in the main square, sometimes for days on end. You watch them, hidden from view, a mixture of fear and morbid fascination gripping you. The sight is both repellent and strangely compelling. The rhythmic rise and fall of the whips, the sight of blood flying, the sounds of their chanting and weeping. It's a profoundly disturbing spectacle. Some of them work themselves into a frenzy, their eyes rolled back, seemingly oblivious to the pain. Others appear to be in a trance-like state. You can smell the sweat, the blood, and the unwashed bodies, even from a distance. It's a visceral, overwhelming assault on the senses. It's like stumbling upon a secret, terrifying cult in the middle of nowhere. Their devotion's so extreme it borders on madness. A quirky and rather unsettling detail about some flagellant groups was their complex internal organization and their specific rituals. Many had leaders, often charismatic figures, who claimed to have received divine revelations. They had prescribed prayers, hymns, often composed by themselves, lamenting the sins of the world and the horrors of the plague, and specific numbers of lashes to be administered at set times. Some even developed their own distinctive costumes or symbols. It wasn't just random, uncontrolled violence, it was a highly ritualized, if deeply disturbing form of religious expression. They saw themselves as soldiers of Christ fighting the plague with the weapons of penance. Historians still argue about the true motivations and composition of the flagellant groups. Were they genuinely devout individuals driven to extreme measures by overwhelming fear and a desire for salvation? Or were they, in some cases, opportunists, social misfits, or even heretics, using the guise of piety to challenge established church authority or to incite social unrest? The church itself had a deeply ambivalent and ultimately hostile relationship with the flagellants. Initially, some local clergy tolerated or even encouraged them, seeing their piety as a positive sign. However, as the movement grew and some flagellant groups began to preach their own unorthodox doctrines, criticized the clergy whom they often accused of corruption and failing to stop the plague, and even claimed the authority to forgive sins, the church hierarchy became alarmed. Pope Clement VI eventually condemned the flagellant movement in 1349, and they were subsequently suppressed, sometimes violently. For you witnessing such a procession, the theological debates are irrelevant. What you see is raw, unadulterated human desperation taken to an almost unimaginable extreme. These people are so terrified, so convinced of their own sinfulness and God's anger, that they are willing to inflict horrific pain upon themselves in public, hoping it will make a difference. It's a stark reminder of the psychological devastation wrought by the plague. It has not only killed bodies, but it has twisted minds, pushing people to the very edge of sanity and beyond. You can't help but feel a strange mixture of pity and revulsion. Part of you wants to shout at them, to tell them it's useless, that their suffering will change nothing. But another part of you, the part that still yearns for some answer, some meaning, some way to appease the terrible forces that have destroyed your world, can almost understand their desperate logic. If prayer and piety don't work, perhaps pain will. You withdraw silently, not wanting to be seen. The last thing you need is to be caught up in their fervor, or worse, to be seen as an unrepentant sinner by a group of people who are literally whipping themselves into a religious frenzy. The encounter leaves you shaken. It's another layer of horror in this post-plague world. Not only must you contend with death, hunger, and loneliness, but also with the unpredictable and sometimes terrifying manifestations of human beings pushed to their absolute limits. The flagellant's bloody march across the landscape is a grim testament to a society that has looked into the abyss and found only its own reflection, screaming in pain and terror. The encounter with the flagellants, or even just the credible rumor of their passing, leaves a dark stain on your already battered psyche. Their extreme response to the plague is a visceral reminder of the pervasive fear and the desperate search for meaning in a world turned upside down. This profound societal trauma didn't just manifest in extreme religious practices, it seeped into every aspect of culture, most visibly and enduringly in art. As you move through the desolate landscape, perhaps stumbling upon a small abandoned chapel, or later, if you dare to venture into a recovering town, you would begin to notice a shift in the imagery that adorns public spaces and private devotions. Art, always a mirror to the human condition, now reflects a dark, macabre age. Before the plague, much of medieval art, particularly religious art, focused on themes of salvation, the majesty of God, the lives of saints, and the promise of heaven. While reminders of death and judgment were certainly present, they were often balanced by messages of hope and redemption. Now the emphasis shifts dramatically. Death itself becomes a central character, an ever-present, almost triumphant figure. You might see crude fresco on a church wall, hastily painted, depicting skeletal figures dancing with popes, kings, merchants, and peasants alike. A grim reminder that death spares no one, regardless of rank or wealth. This is the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a hugely popular artistic motif in the decades following the Black Death. It's a stark, egalitarian message. We're all in this grim conga line together, heading for the grave. This obsession with the macabre is a clear historical fact. The art of the late 14th and 15th centuries is replete with images of skeletons, decaying corpses, and personifications of death. Effigies on tombs, which once depicted knights in their prime or noble ladies in their finery, began to feature transy figures, shockingly realistic sculptures of the deceased in a state of putrefaction, often with worms crawling through their decaying flesh. The message was blunt. Memento mori. Remember, you will die, and not just die, but decay in a most unpleasant manner. It's like the art world collectively decided to swap out serene landscapes for close-ups of roadkill. You might find a crudely printed woodcut, perhaps dropped by a traveling preacher or peddler, showing the 3 living and the 3 dead. This was another popular theme. 3 young noblemen out hunting or hawking encounter. 3 animated corpses, often their own future selves, who warn them of the transience of life and the inevitability of death. The expressions on the faces of the living, shock, horror, dawning realization, would mirror your own feelings as you navigate this changed world. It's a direct, unsubtle confrontation with mortality, a far cry from the often idealized and heroic imagery of earlier periods. A quirky and rather specific artistic detail that emerged in this period is the increased depiction of St. Roch, or Rocco, who was traditionally invoked against plague. He's typically shown as a pilgrim, pointing to a plague bubo on his thigh, often accompanied by a dog carrying a loaf of bread. Legend says a dog sustained him when he was ill. The proliferation of his image in paintings, statues, and household shrines speaks volumes about the anxieties of the time. He became a sort of specialized celestial insurance agent against the plague. Similarly, Saint Sebastian, often depicted pierced with arrows, a visual metaphor for the random strikes of pestilence, also saw a surge in popularity. People were desperately seeking protectors, divine intercessors who understood their suffering. Historians still argue about the precise interpretation of this surge in macabre art. Was it primarily an expression of overwhelming pessimism, a society wallowing in its grief and fear? Or did it serve a more didactic purpose, encouraging piety and a focus on the afterlife in the face of earthly suffering? Perhaps it was also a way of processing trauma, of confronting the horrors of the plague by depicting them, by giving them form and narrative, by making death a familiar, almost everyday character. Perhaps people sought to rob it of some of its terrifying power, to domesticate the horror. For you, these images, whether seen in a grand cathedral if you ever reach one, or a humble village church, would be deeply unsettling, yet strangely validating. They confirm that your personal experience of horror and loss is shared, that the entire world, or at least your corner of it, is grappling with the same shadows. The serene Madonnas and triumphant Christs of earlier art might feel distant, almost irrelevant to your current reality. But a skeletal death leading a pope by the hand, that resonates, that feels true. It's a bitter kind of comfort, the comfort of shared misery, but it's comfort nonetheless. The art reflects a society obsessed with its own mortality, a society that has been forced to look death squarely in the face and can no longer afford the luxury of ignoring it. The bright colors and confident lines of earlier styles often give way to darker palettes, more agitated compositions, and a raw emotional intensity. It's as if the artists themselves are trying to exorcise their own demons to make sense of the senseless. Every depiction of a grinning skeleton or a decaying corpse is a whisper from the grave, a reminder that the world you once knew with its illusions of permanence and order is gone. The new art is a chilling, unflinching portrait of an age of anxiety, an age where death is not just an abstract concept, but a recent unwelcome house guest who has overstayed his welcome and redecorated the place in shades of bone and sorrow. The pervasive sense of death and societal unraveling, so vividly reflected in the art of the time, also spurred the ruling classes, those who survived and managed to retain some semblance of authority, into action. But this action was often less about alleviating the suffering of the common people and more about reimposing order, controlling the increasingly restless workforce, and preserving the remnants of the old social hierarchy. As you slowly, cautiously, begin to encounter pockets of civilization again, perhaps a fortified town that managed to withstand the worst of the plague, or a manor where a new lord is desperately trying to assert control. You would become aware of new laws, new regulations, all designed to put the genie of social change back into the bottle. Chief among these were statutes aimed at controlling labor. Imagine you finally decided to leave your desolate village. Driven by hunger and the crushing loneliness, you travel for days, avoiding other lone travelers. Who knows if they're desperate bandits or fellow sufferers, and sleeping in ditches or abandoned barns. Eventually, you approach a market town. The guards at the gate are suspicious, wary. They demand to know who you are, where you're from, what your business is. They might even check you for signs of lingering illness. If you're allowed in, you'd soon hear talk of new ordinances, of strict rules governing wages, movement, and even what kind of clothes different classes of people are allowed to wear. This is the hand of authority reasserting itself, and it often felt heavy and restrictive to the survivors. The most famous example of this type of legislation is the English Statute of Labourers, first issued in 1349 and then enacted by Parliament in 1351, with similar laws appearing across Europe. This is a crucial historical fact. These laws typically aim to fix wages at pre-plague levels, to compel all able-bodied men and women to work for anyone who required their labor, and to restrict them from leaving their current parish or master in search of better pay. Penalties for demanding or offering higher wages could be severe, including fines or imprisonment. The preamble to the English statute explicitly states that it was enacted because labourers were taking advantage of the scarcity of workers to demand excessive wages. From the perspective of the landowners and employers, this was an attempt to restore economic stability. From the perspective of a surviving peasant like you, it was a blatant attempt to rob you of your newfound bargaining power. You might see a notice nailed to the market cross, read aloud by a town crier proclaiming these new rules. Let it be known that no reaper shall demand more than 3 pence a day, plus food, and no master carpenter more than 4 pence. Any found demanding more or refusing reasonable work at these rates shall be clapped in the stocks. You who had perhaps dreamed of earning a decent wage, of having some choice in your employment, would feel a bitter disappointment. The lords and masters were fighting back, trying to turn back the clock to a time when your labour was cheap and your obedience assured. It's like finally finding an oasis after days in the desert, only to discover the well is guarded by men who want to charge you your last drop of water for a sip. A quirky and revealing aspect of these attempts at social control were the sumptuary laws. These were regulations that dictated what people of different social classes could wear, the types of fabric, the colours, the amount of ornamentation. While sumptuary laws existed before the Black Death, they were often strengthened and more rigorously enforced afterwards. Why? Because with increased wages, some commoners were starting to afford clothing and adornments previously reserved for the nobility. This blurring of visual class distinctions was deeply unsettling to the elite. They wanted to ensure that a peasant still looked like a peasant even if he was earning more. So you might be fined for wearing a tunic of a certain forbidden colour, or for having fur trim on your cloak, even if you could now afford it. It was about keeping you in your place, visually and economically. Know your station, peasant. Even if your station now comes with slightly better pay, don't you dare look like you're enjoying it too much. Historians still argue about the overall effectiveness of these statutes and social control measures. While they undoubtedly caused hardship and resentment and may have temporarily suppressed wages in some areas, many scholars believe they ultimately failed to halt the long-term economic and social shifts brought about by the massive depopulation. The fundamental law of supply and demand for labour was simply too powerful. Landowners still needed workers, and workers, despite the laws, still found ways to demand better terms or to move to where conditions were more favourable. The enforcement was often difficult, especially in rural areas, and there was widespread evasion and resistance. For you, these laws would represent a new kind of struggle. The fight for physical survival against hunger and disease might be slowly easing if you find a community, but now you face a fight for your economic freedom and your human dignity against a system determined to keep you down. You might have to work in secret for higher wages or risk punishment by moving to a different town or manor where the rules are less strictly enforced. You become a reluctant outlaw, not out of malice, but out of a desire for a fair reward for your essential labour. The authorities might see you as greedy and insubordinate, a threat to the social order. You see yourself as someone who has survived hell and deserves something better than a return to the old servitude. The statutes are a clear message. The elites have noticed the ground shifting beneath their feet, and they are trying desperately to stop the earthquake. Your very existence and your quiet demand for a better life is a small act of rebellion. The attempts by authorities to reassert control through statutes and sumptuary laws, while perhaps providing a thin veneer of order in some recovering towns and manors, could not mask the deeper truth. Society as you knew it was unraveling. The old certainties, the familiar rhythms, the unquestioned hierarchies, all had been shaken to their core by the plague's indiscriminate fury. It wasn't just about labour shortages or economic disruption. It was a fundamental crisis of confidence in the very structures that were supposed to govern life. You feel this unraveling in the wary glances of strangers, in the abandoned fields, in the hushed, fearful conversations you might overhear, if you manage to find your way to a place with more than a handful of survivors. The bonds of community once strong in your village, where everyone knew everyone else and relied on mutual support, have been frayed or shattered. In a larger town, you might find yourself surrounded by unfamiliar faces, many of them displaced like yourself, all carrying their own burdens of grief and suspicion. Who can you trust? The person offering you work might be fair, or they might be looking to exploit your desperation. The friendly stranger sharing a drink at the tavern, if taverns are even open and functioning, might be a fellow soul seeking solace, or they might be a thief waiting for an opportunity. The social cohesion that relied on shared history and common experience has been replaced by a pervasive sense of anxiety and instability. It's like a finely woven tapestry that has had half its threads violently ripped out. The remaining pattern is distorted, weakened, and barely recognizable. This sense of a society unraveling is a key theme in contemporary accounts of the post-plague world. Chroniclers lamented the breakdown of law and order in some areas, the rise in crime, the abandonment of traditional moral standards. With so many priests and authority figures dead, and with the church's own prestige damaged, the institutions that traditionally upheld social norms were weakened, people were adrift, and some, in their desperation or opportunism, turned to less savory means of survival. You might hear stories of banditry on the roads becoming more common, of property disputes settled by violence rather than by law, of a general coarsening of manners and morals. It's not that everyone became a villain, far from it, but the normal constraints on behavior were loosened when the world itself seemed to have lost its moorings. You see the physical signs of this unraveling everywhere. Houses stand empty and decaying, not just in your abandoned village, but even in towns that were only partially depopulated. Public buildings might be neglected, roads unrepaired. The careful order of the agricultural landscape, the neat strips in the open fields, the well-maintained fences and ditches gives way to a scruffier, more chaotic environment as nature begins to reclaim what humanity can no longer manage. It's a visual representation of the breakdown of collective effort and civic responsibility. It's like watching a well-tended garden slowly revert to wilderness after the gardener has vanished. A quirky and rather telling indicator of this societal unraveling can be found in the changes to legal and administrative records. In many places, the meticulous record-keeping of manorial courts or town councils became erratic or ceased altogether for a time, simply because the scribes, clerics, and officials were dead or had fled. Gaps appear in the historical record, silent testament to a period when the normal machinery of governance ground to a halt, wills went unprobated, deeds untransferred, crimes unrecorded. For a society that, for all its flaws, was increasingly reliant on written documentation, this was a significant disruption. It created a kind of administrative fog, making it harder to resolve disputes, collect taxes, or enforce laws. Historians still argue about the extent to which this unraveling was a temporary crisis from which society fairly quickly recovered, or if it represented a more profound and long-lasting transformation. Some emphasize the resilience of medieval institutions and the speed with which order was restored in many areas. Others point to the recurrent plague outbreaks, the persistent labor unrest, and the deep psychological scars as evidence of a more fundamental and enduring societal shift. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a period of acute crisis followed by a slow, painful, and uneven process of rebuilding, resulting in a society that was demonstrably different from what had come before. For you living through it, the academic debates are less important than the daily experience of uncertainty. The old ways of life are gone, that much is clear. Your parents and grandparents lived in a world that, for all its hardships, was predictable. They knew their place, their obligations, their likely future. You have no such certainty. Your future is a blank page. And while that might hold a sliver of frightening possibility for someone with ambition and luck, for most, it's simply terrifying. The traditional paths, learn your father's trade, marry someone from a neighboring family, work the same land your ancestors worked, are overgrown or entirely washed away. You feel like an actor in a play where the stage has collapsed, the script has been lost, and most of the other actors have vanished. You're left to improvise your role, to find your way in a new, unfamiliar setting with no director to guide you. This unraveling isn't just about the collapse of external structures. It's an internal disorientation, a loss of the familiar landmarks that once helped you navigate your life. The world feels less reliable, less knowable, and far more dangerous. The threads that held society together, kinship, custom, law, faith, have all been stretched to their breaking point, and some have snapped entirely, leaving you to drift in the resulting chaos. The slow, painful process of navigating this unraveled world, of trying to piece together some semblance of a life from the wreckage, takes its toll not just on your physical well-being, but deep within your mind. The horrors you've witnessed, the losses you've endured, the constant fear and uncertainty. These are not things one simply gets over. They leave scars deep and lasting on the individual psyche and on the collective consciousness of the surviving community. Even if you find a measure of safety, a source of food, perhaps even a few companions, the shadows of the plague years will stretch long into your future. You find yourself easily startled. A sudden noise, a fleeting shadow can send your heart racing, your palms sweating, bringing back a flush of the old terror. Sleep offers little respite, often troubled by vivid, disturbing dreams, replays of the sickness, of the empty village, the faces of the dead. You might wake in a cold sweat, disoriented, the lingering images of the nightmare clinging to you like cobwebs. During the day, you might experience moments of detachment, as if you're watching yourself from a distance, an actor going through the motions of life without any real emotional connection. Or, conversely, you might be prone to sudden, overwhelming waves of grief or anger triggered by something as simple as a familiar scent or a snatch of a forgotten song. These are the invisible wounds, the scars on the psyche, far harder to heal than any physical ailment. The psychological impact of surviving such a devastating pandemic is a significant historical reality, though often harder to document directly than economic or demographic changes. Medieval people didn't have our modern vocabulary of trauma, PTSD, or anxiety disorders, but contemporary chronicles and personal accounts often describe behaviors and emotional states that are clearly indicative of profound psychological distress. There are mentions of people falling into deep melancholy, what we might call depression, of others becoming obsessively fearful of death or disease, and of a general sense of weariness and disillusionment with the world. It's like an entire society is suffering from a collective form of shell shock. You might find yourself becoming intensely superstitious, even more so than before. If you survived when so many others perished, perhaps it was due to some small, insignificant action you took or failed to take. You might obsessively repeat that action or avoid certain places or behaviors, clinging to any ritual that seems to offer a sliver of protection or control in a world that has proven itself to be terrifyingly arbitrary. This isn't foolishness, it's a coping mechanism, an attempt to impose some kind of order onto the chaos to ward off the feeling of utter helplessness. You might carry a lucky pebble in your pocket, convinced it saved you, even though rationally you know it's just a stone. But in these times, rationality often takes a back seat to the desperate need for comfort, however illusory. A quirky and rather sad psychological phenomenon, sometimes observed in the aftermath of disasters, is a kind of affect blunting or emotional numbness among survivors. Having witnessed so much death and suffering, some people seem to lose the capacity for strong emotion, or they suppress it as a defense mechanism. They might appear indifferent, apathetic, even cold. It's not that they don't feel, it's that feeling too much has become unbearable. You might encounter individuals like this, their eyes holding a haunted, distant look, their voices flat, their interactions minimal. Or you might even recognize this tendency in yourself. a deliberate or unconscious walling off of your emotions to protect yourself from further pain. It's like a part of you has died even though your body survived. Historians still argue about the long-term psychological legacy of the Black Death on European society. Did it contribute to a more pessimistic worldview, a greater preoccupation with sin and salvation, as reflected in the macabre and the flagellant movements? Or did it, for some, lead to a kind of reckless hedonism, alive for today, for tomorrow we die attitude? Perhaps it fostered both in different individuals and at different times. The trauma was so widespread and so profound that it likely provoked a wide spectrum of psychological responses, none of them particularly healthy by modern standards. The relationships you form with other survivors, if you are fortunate enough to do so, will also be colored by this shared trauma. There might be a deep bond, an unspoken understanding between those who have passed through the same fire. But there might also be suspicion, rivalry, and the constant unspoken question. Why you and not them? The grief is a shared burden, but it can also be an isolating one. Everyone has lost someone. Everyone carries their own ghosts. Sometimes this shared experience can bring people together, creating new makeshift families and communities. Other times it can drive them apart, each individual locked in their own private landscape of sorrow. These psychological scars aren't just personal, they are societal. A community that has endured such a catastrophe is a change community. It may be more resilient in some ways, but it is also more wary, more fearful, perhaps more cynical. The old optimism, the old trust in the stability of the world is gone, replaced by a harder, more somber understanding of life's fragility. You are a part of this change society, the walking embodiment of its trauma. The plague might have passed, the immediate crisis might be over, but the echoes of its passage will reverberate in your mind and in the collective mind of your generation for a long, long time to come. The world is no longer a safe or predictable place, and that knowledge once learned can never be truly unlearned. Just when you think you might be able to breathe again, to carve out some semblance of a new life in this scarred world, a chilling rumor reaches your ears. Or worse, you see the unmistakable signs yourself. The plague has returned. It might not be on the same cataclysmic scale as the first devastating wave of the Black Death, but these subsequent smaller outbreaks, sometimes called the pestis, secunda, tertia, and so on, were a terrifyingly regular feature of life for decades, even centuries after the initial pandemic. For a survivor, each new visitation was a fresh hell, a cruel reminder that the monster was never truly vanquished, only sleeping. Imagine you've settled in a small recovering town. You found work, perhaps mending tools or helping in the fields. You've even started to make a few tentative connections with other survivors. There's a fragile sense of hope in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, the worst is over. Then, one day, someone in the next street falls ill with the telltale fever and swellings, a child, then an old woman. Panic, barely suppressed for years, erupts anew. Doors are barred, shutters closed. The familiar chilling silence begins to descend once more. The cry of plague echoes through the narrow streets and your heart plummets. Not again. Please, not again. These recurrent outbreaks are a well-documented historical fact. The plague didn't just strike once and disappear. It became endemic in Europe for centuries, flaring up in localized epidemics every few years or every couple of decades. For example, England experienced major national outbreaks roughly every 10 to 20 years, from the mid-14th to the late 17th century. This meant that several generations of people lived under the constant threat of its return. For a survivor of the initial Black Death, this would have been an almost unbearable psychological burden. It's like surviving a shipwreck only to find yourself living on a coastline constantly battered by tsunamis. Each new outbreak brought back all the old terrors, but with an added layer of weary resignation. You know the drill now. You know the futility of most remedies. You know the agony of watching loved ones sicken and die. The grim rituals of quarantine, if your town was organized enough to attempt it, of marking infected houses, of hurried burials in plague pits, all would have to be endured once more. The authorities, having learned something from previous waves, might be quicker to implement measures like restricting travel or ordering public hygiene initiatives like cleaning the streets, though their understanding of how disease spread was still flawed. But these measures often came too late or were insufficient against such a virulent foe. A quirky and rather grim consequence of these recurring outbreaks was the development of a kind of plague industry. This included not just the aforementioned searchers of the dead and buriers, but also specialized plague doctors with their bizarre beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs to filter the miasma, though more likely offering psychological comfort than actual protection. There were also scribes who specialized in writing plague bills, lists of the dead, and merchants who dealt in mourning cloth or preventative amulets. It's a dark testament to human adaptability that even a recurring catastrophe could become for some a source of livelihood. For you, however, seeing these familiar figures reappear would only underscore the grim reality that the nightmare was starting all over again. Historians still argue about the specific epidemiological factors that caused these recurrent waves. Were they reinfections from lingering local rodent reservoirs? Were new strains of Yersinia pestis being periodically reintroduced from trade routes? Or was it a complex interplay of environmental factors, human immunity levels, and public health responses, or lack thereof? Whatever the precise reasons, the effect on the population was one of sustained trauma and demographic stagnation. Just as communities began to recover their numbers, another outbreak would sweep through, culling the young and the vulnerable, setting back progress. For a survivor like you, who had already seen the world emptied once, these return visits of the plague must have felt like a personal affront, a cruel cosmic joke. Any fragile sense of security you had managed to build would be shattered. Friendships and fledgling relationships would be tested, perhaps broken by fear and loss. The economic recovery, always precarious, would falter as trade ceased, workshops closed, and fields once again went untended. It would be a cycle of devastation, partial recovery, and then fresh devastation. How could anyone plan for the future, invest in a business, or even dare to hope for a long life when the spectre of the plague was always lurking just over the horizon? You might find yourself becoming even more insular, more distrustful. If you survive the first wave and then a second and perhaps even a third, you might start to feel like you're living on borrowed time, that your luck is bound to run out eventually. Or worse, you might be seen by others with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Why does he always survive? Is he protected by God or by something darker? The psychological toll of living through repeated life-threatening events is immense. It would ingrain a deep-seated fear, a kind of societal PTSD that would be passed down through generations. The cry of plague would become the most dreaded sound in your world, a herald of suffering, loss, and the return of all your worst nightmares. Each recurrence was a brutal lesson. The world was not safe, and the reprieve was only ever temporary. The relentless cycle of plague outbreaks, the constant shadow of death, the unraveling of familiar social structures, and the deep psychological wounds all contribute to the final, inescapable truth. You are navigating a fundamentally changed and in many ways bleaker world. Even if decades pass and the major epidemics become less frequent, the memory of the Great Pestilence and its subsequent visitations has irrevocably altered the landscape of your life and the society around you. The world your parents knew with its own hardships, but also its underlying sense of order and predictability, is gone forever. You walk through a town that has perhaps seen some measure of recovery. There are more people now than in those first terrible years. Shops are open. Some fields are cultivated. The basic rhythms of life have resumed. But it's different. There's a hollowness to it, an undercurrent of anxiety that wasn't there before. You see it in the faces of the people, especially those old. Enough to remember the worst times, there's a sadness in their eyes, a weariness that never quite disappears. The laughter, when it comes, feels a little more fragile. The celebrations a little more subdued, as if everyone is subconsciously waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's like a community that has survived a devastating earthquake. The buildings might be repaired, but the cracks in the foundations and in the collective psyche remain. The demographic shifts are stark. The population of Europe took centuries to recover to pre-plague levels. This is a crucial historical fact. Villages like yours might remain deserted or be reoccupied by far fewer people. Land that was once intensively farmed might have reverted to pasture or even woodland simply because there weren't enough hands to work it. This changed the physical landscape in many areas, leading to more forests and less arable land. Family structures were also different. With so many deaths, people married younger, and widows and widowers remarried more quickly, often to consolidate property or simply out of a need for companionship and mutual support. In a harsh world, the traditional extended family with multiple generations living together became less common, replaced by smaller, more fragile nuclear units. You notice a change in attitudes, a subtle shift in the collective mood. There's a greater preoccupation with death and the afterlife, as evidenced by the enduring popularity of macabre art and devotional practices focused on penance and remembrance. But there's also paradoxically a greater emphasis on the present, on earthly concerns. With life so uncertain, some people adopted a more pragmatic, even materialistic outlook. If your time on earth could be cut short so brutally, then perhaps it was best to enjoy what you could while you could. This might manifest as a greater desire for comfort, for good food and drink, for small luxuries if one could afford them. It wasn't necessarily hedonism, but a recognition of life's preciousness and fragility. It's like someone who's had a near-death experience suddenly appreciating the taste of fresh bread or the warmth of the sun in a way they never did before. A quirky and perhaps unexpected consequence of this changed world was the impact on language. With so many people dead, local dialects sometimes shifted or even disappeared, while others became more widespread as populations mixed and migrated in search of work or safety. The very words people used, the stories they told, the songs they sang were imbued with the memory of the plague. New saints rose to prominence, new prayers were composed, new folk tales emerged, all trying to make sense of the senseless, to incorporate this overwhelming experience into the cultural narrative. Historians still argue about the overall legacy of the Black Death. Was it an unmitigated disaster that set Europe back for centuries? Or did it, by disrupting old rigid structures and creating new opportunities for survivors, inadvertently pave the way for some of the social and economic changes that characterized the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance? Some argue that the labor shortages and rising wages for peasants contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more dynamic market-based economy. Others point to the immense suffering, the loss of knowledge, and the prolonged period of instability. The truth is likely complex and multifaceted, with both devastating short-term consequences and transformative long-term effects. For you, an individual survivor, these grand historical narratives offer little comfort. What you know is that the world is less certain, less kind than it once was. The bonds of trust have been eroded, the consolations of faith have been shaken. The simple joys of life are perpetually tinged with the memory of loss. You carry your dead with you, not just in your memories, but in the very fabric of your being. You're more resilient, perhaps, forged in a terrible fire, but also more brittle, more easily broken by new sorrows. You look at the children playing in the dusty street, children born after the great waves of plague, children who know this changed world as the only world. They laugh and run with an innocence you can no longer fully access. You hope with a fierce, protective ache that their lives will be easier, that the monster will stay sleeping for them. But you know with a chilling certainty that settles deep in your bones that the world they inherit is one that has been fundamentally and forever altered by the great dying. It is a world where the dance of death is a familiar tune, where the shadows are a little deeper, and where the sweet, cloying scent of fear never entirely fades from the air. This is the legacy of survival. To walk forever in a landscape haunted by ghosts, forever aware of how quickly and how terribly everything can be taken away. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows once more. The air grows cooler, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant hearths, a fragile sign of continuity, of life persisting despite everything. You pull your worn cloak tighter around you. A small gesture against the encroaching chill, both physical and existential. The world is indeed changed, and you, its reluctant inheritor, must find your way through its bleaker, more uncertain paths, one weary step at a time. The shadows lengthen further now, and the sounds of even this recovering, changed world begin to soften, to fade into the approaching night. Your journey as a medieval plague survivor has been a harrowing one, filled with loss, fear, and a relentless struggle for mere existence. But even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit, however battered and scarred, clings to the possibility of dawn. You have witnessed the fragility of life, the collapse of order, the desperate measures of terrified souls. You have felt the earth shift beneath your feet as old certainties crumbled and new unsettling realities took their place. Yet through it all, you endured. You found sustenance where there seemed to be none. You navigated the treacherous currents of a society in turmoil. You carried the weight of memory, the ghosts of your lost world, and somehow you kept moving forward. The road ahead remains uncertain, the future a veil not easily pierced, but the simple act of drawing breath, of feeling the cool night air on your skin, is a testament to a stubborn, quiet resilience. The world may be bleaker, the shadows longer, but you are still here. Let that thought, that quiet acknowledgement of your own enduring presence, settle around you like a comforting blanket. The horrors are real, but so too is the strength found in the aftermath. As the last vestiges of light surrender to the darkness, allow the sounds of your own world, the gentle hum of your fan, the distant sigh of traffic to gently pull you back from those desolate medieval landscapes. The fear and the sorrow can recede now like a tide going out, leaving behind only the quiet peace of your own safe space. Let the weight of that imagined history lift from your shoulders. You are here now, secure, and as you drift towards sleep, may your dreams be untroubled by the ghosts of the past, filled instead with peace and the gentle promise of a new day, untouched by the shadows we've explored tonight.